and we're going to go to the Atlanta-Carolina game, our first 1 o'clock game on Sunday. Carolina, Christian McCaffrey, he's still, this week he's still on IR. There is some tone, some energy out there, some hope that Christian McCaffrey may make a return next week when he's eligible to come off the IR. Now, that would still be beating the original timeline by a few weeks. So it's still going to be highly questionable. And so I'm not telling you to drop Mike Davis or anything like that. But what I will say is this, on the off chance that winds up being true, if you own Mike Davis and you don't own Christian McCaffrey, this is the week before Sunday to sell high on him. First of all, it's a great matchup against Atlanta, so people are going to want him. We just talked about selling on Ronald Jones because we know he's on a short leash and his fantasy value is on a short leash, and people are desperate at running back. Well, you'll be able to get a prettier penny for Mike Davis, even if he only has a week or two left before Christian McCaffrey comes back. This is the time to sell on him. If somebody's going to offer you a player who has long-term fantasy value right now for Mike Davis, and it's a mid-level RB2 or a mid-level wide receiver 2 the rest of the way, you pull the trigger on that deal. If you can get a Kenyon Drake, who is somebody we've talked about on the show as a buy low candidate for a Mike Davis, you pull the trigger on that deal. Those are things to be looking out for if you do not own Christian McCaffrey. If you do own Christian McCaffrey, I'm staying with Mike Davis. Because even when McCaffrey comes back, you need to see, A, is he 100% or did he rush back? B, high ankle sprains, they can be re-aggravated. So I'm going to be holding on to Mike Davis to protect my Christian McCaffrey investment if I own him. But if you don't, get what you can get for Mike Davis while you can still get something very valuable because he's playing against Atlanta this week. And he still might have, you can make the argument, he still might have 2 to 3 more weeks possibly before McCaffrey actually does come back. But do it now before we suddenly find out, oh, McCaffrey magically comes back next week, which I just wouldn't put it past them. So kind of keep that in mind for your fantasy lineups. As far as this game goes, though, playing all your Carolina Panthers, talk about another guy that you might want to be selling high on after this week, not going into this week with like we do with Mike Davis, but after this week, you're going to want to sell high on DJ Moore. I've talked about this extensively, that Robbie Anderson is the receiver that you want to own in Carolina. He is the wide receiver 2. DJ Moore is going to be a wide receiver 3, possibly wide receiver 4 the rest of the way here. That's what you're kind of looking at. So in this game against Atlanta, if he winds up having a decent game, which he should because he has been seeing enough target volume, you're going to want to go ahead and sell high on that production because between his name and having a good game against Atlanta, a lot of people will say, like, oh, they might look at it as like, oh, maybe this is a turning point. If you get your hands on a wide receiver 2 or an RB2 for DJ Moore the rest of the way, you pull the trigger on that deal after this week. I think you're going to need the production from this week, and I think there's a decent chance you're going to get it because of the matchup. So then you pull the trigger going into week 6 on a deal like that, and you sell high on DJ Moore because Robbie Anderson's the guy to own. Robbie Anderson is going to be in our top 10 of wide receivers this upcoming week. And I don't think that should surprise anybody. We know he has big play capability. We know him and Teddy Bridgewater clearly have a great rapport. He's been getting an insane amount of targets. He's in the top 10 in targets in the league. And it's against Atlanta, who has nobody left on defense, healthy, or even if they were, let's face it, they weren't that good to begin with. So, yeah, I'm fine. Robbie Anderson is going to be a wide receiver 1 this week. And Teddy Bridgewater is our number 1 streaming quarterback on the week. We have him as a QB1. I have him at number 6 overall at the quarterback position. He's been playing very solid football. He's had a high floor so far for fantasy purposes. He gets this matchup against Atlanta where the offense is clicking for Teddy Bridgewater and the Carolina Panthers right now. One where Robbie Anderson and DJ Moore should be able to get open on with some consistency. Mike Davis has been playing well, especially in the pass catching game. Teddy Bridgewater is going to be able to play within himself and still go for 300 yards and 2 touchdowns minimum in this matchup. So we love Teddy Bridgewater. He is our number 1 streaming quarterback on the week and a must play in our eyes. Mike Davis, obviously, if you have him, you don't trade him, then you're playing him. He's an RB2. Ian Thomas is in the streaming territory because it is Atlanta. But the problem with Ian Thomas is that more times than not, him and Curtis Samuel are the ones that are kind of getting left out of the consistent volume. So they could both have good games this week, possibly. But the problem with them is that you don't know if it's their week to be involved, really. Because it has to go Robbie Anderson and DJ Moore and the running back, whether it's Christian McCaffrey or Mike Davis first. And then it to kind of dictates, it kind of goes back and forth. Is Ian Thomas going to be involved, or is Curtis Samuel going to be involved? And you don't know which ones that's going to be. So while Ian Thomas, you can make the argument, is a streamable option this week, I think there's guys with much higher floors that you could be able to stream over Ian Thomas. So we move on to the Atlanta side of the ball, where we don't expect to have Julio Jones this week, unfortunately. He's doubtful with a hamstring. Today, he's supposed to be getting in individual work. Dan Quinn was talking about tomorrow they're going to do more of an assessment on whether or not he can go on Sunday. So it doesn't sound like they're completely ruling him out, which is kind of what we expected to happen at this point. But it would be very hard for me to imagine, after re-aggravating the injury on Monday, a hamstring issue that's been bothering him for several weeks now, that Atlanta, in the position that they are, would then run him out again and risk him getting knocked out again within the first half and re-aggravating it again. Right now, the best thing for Julio would be to sit. I know he sat 2 weeks ago. Clearly, he's not over it yet. You're coming off a shortened week. The best thing for him, for fantasy, I know it'd be terrible not to have Julio Jones this week if you're an owner of his, but the best thing for you, the best thing for Julio, the best thing for the Falcons is for him to sit this week and get healthy. And we hope that actually winds up being the case, because then you're going to be forced in this position where you're going to have to play Julio because he's on the field and he's Julio Jones and it's Carolina Panthers. And you're going to be, the entire game, you're going to be running the risk, you're going to be biting your nails, because you know at any given second, he's going to re-aggravate and get knocked out of the game again. Or he's just going to be out there as a decoy, because they'll just have him out there and then they'll throw the ball to Calvin Ridley or Russell Gage. So for the sanity of all fantasy owners, we actually need Julio Jones to just sit this week, because there's too many different variables. There's too wide of a range of outcomes. So that's what's going on there for now. Matt Ryan, he does come in as a top 10 quarterback for us this week. He's QB8, so he's a lower QB1. I know that his last 2 games have not been great, but this is a Panthers matchup, and even with or without Julio, he should be able to move the ball through the air with Calvin Ridley, with Russell Gage, with Hayden Hurst. The question's really going to be, does he get vultured by Todd Gurley? Because that's kind of what's going on right now. They're getting inside the goal line, and they're handing it off to Todd Gurley, and he's converting. If he doesn't convert, then they throw in those instances, and then all of a sudden Matt Ryan gets a few more touchdowns, and he doesn't have to depend on it coming from 20 yards or more out. But if they keep getting within 5 and they keep handing off to Todd Gurley, that's kind of been the difference the past couple of weeks, is that Matt Ryan hasn't been able to throw for many touchdowns. So that's going to be the question here against this game against Carolina. But it's too good of a matchup. We know Atlanta has to throw the ball. We know their defense is terrible, and we know Carolina's offense is pretty good right now. So it all lines up for Matt Ryan to have to throw the ball around, 38 to 40 times minimum in that range. That's a volume that you're looking for. He should provide you with a safe floor at minimum in this game, with or without Julio Jones. Todd Gurley, just talked about him a little bit. He comes in as a high-end RB too, because he's scoring touchdowns. He just is. It's what he does now. Is he touchdown dependent? Yeah. Does he score them a lot though? So far, through 4 weeks, he has 4 touchdowns? It's pretty good. And in this game against Carolina, there's a very good chance that they'll get within the side of the 5 and they'll hand it off to him. There's a very real chance that he's going to get another touchdown, or this is a game in which you could see him getting 2. So it may not be pretty between the 20s right now. He may not be involved in the passing game right now. But as far as running back's concerned, he's one of the few guys that's scoring at a consistent rate. So you can play him as an RB2, especially in this game against the Panthers, with some confidence. And I talked about this last week. I talked about the week before. I'm going to talk about this every week, really, that he scores. Every single week that Todd Gurley scores, it just means more and more value for you to sell high at. If you haven't been able to do it up to this point, and you've been listening to this show, well then, buckle your seatbelts. You're going to probably get another touchdown this week, and then try it again next week. Because if he goes through 3 games in a row where he scored, people are going to start to throw away the narrative of Todd Gurley and start to look at him for what he is, which is a touchdown monster and returning fantasy value on it. So there's a very good chance that if you haven't been able to sell high on him yet, which I think you should be able to by now, but if you haven't been able to, his value will go up even more next week after this game. So that's the good news for you there if you're trying to get out of the Todd Gurley business, which I would be, because it just doesn't look good between the 20s. And there's no floor there if he doesn't score. Calvin Ridley, no surprise. He's a wide receiver 1. You're starting him. I know he goosed you last week. He's going to have a better game. You don't have to worry about it. I think the only real question is, do you play Russell Gage or not? Now, he comes in as a wide receiver 4 for us that you can contemplate in the flex, especially if Julio doesn't play. If it's PPR, I can understand the argument there for wanting to put in Russell Gage, but I know he got banged up 2 weeks ago and he came out of that game for a concussion, so he didn't get to play that full game. But against Green Bay this past week, when Julio went out in the second half, it wasn't necessarily Russell Gage who got the target. In fact, he didn't get the targets in the second half. Now, granted, that entire Atlanta passing attack was very odd in that game against Green Bay and nothing what anybody was expecting. I know I was expecting a shootout game. But it just, they mixed in their third and fourth receivers a lot. It wasn't necessarily just going to Calvin Ridley or Russell Gage in that game. So I do have some concerns about the floor that I thought Russell Gage was establishing in the first couple of weeks here in the season as a slot receiver. Now, that's the thing to keep in mind. He's still the slot receiver, and that's still going to be a guy who has a good matchup against the Carolina Panthers. And as long as he sees 6 to 7 targets, which especially without Julio, I don't see why he wouldn't in this game. He should have a decent floor for you. But he does come more in as a wide receiver 4 with some risk because, one, there's not a big upside there. He's not necessarily a touchdown guy. It is going to be Calvin Ridley first. And they just have some other guys getting mixed in right now. But he's an option if you really need it in a desperate situation. Hayden Hurst, he's still a top end streaming tight end. He comes in at tight end 13 for us, so he's a top tight end 2. It hasn't been awesome for Hurst. He hasn't been Austin Hooper of last year. Let's put it that way. But he has been consistently involved. There has been a floor for him each week. And I do believe as the rapport continues, we know Matt Ryan will throw it to the tight end when they get in the end zone. So I think those touchdowns they've been waiting for Hayden Hurst are on the way. And I think they could come this week against Carolina. But I wouldn't panic if you've been a Hayden Hurst owner. He's still a guy who's going to be teetering that tight end 2, tight end 1 territory. He still has tight end 1 potential for the rest of the season, just given the offense. Julio being in or out of the lineup doesn't really seem to affect the usage of Hayden Hurst, which is kind of odd. So even if Julio is out, I wouldn't necessarily look at that as, oh, there's more volume for Hurst. It hasn't really seemed to matter. He's been getting about the same amount of volume whether he's in or out. It's just a matter of, is this the week that Ryan goes to him in the end zone? Guess the Panthers, it should be. And like I said, he is somebody who's been seeing 4 to 5 targets pretty consistently through the first 4 weeks. So I'm good with him being a top end tight end 2. We move on to the Buffalo Bills and the Tennessee Titans. So obviously with this game, this is a disclaimer for this show. This is expecting them to play. I hope. I don't know how it happens because it's Thursday and another player tested positive. So the Titans have now gone, 2 weeks without actually practicing. It's a mess. It's an absolute mess. So on the Titan, we'll start with the Titan side of the ball. Here's what we know. We know Adam Humphries is on the COVID reserve list. We know Corey Davis is on the COVID reserve list. We know A.J. Brown is expected to come back this week. So pretty much the way this passing game is setting up, and I think the only people you can really count on for fantasy football purposes would be A.J. Brown and Jonnu Smith. They're going to get all the passing work. And they're both touchdown guys. Jonnu Smith, I believe, is establishing himself as a possible top 5 tight end the rest of the way, just based on what he had been able to do for the first few weeks of the season. Now, at some point, the Titans are going to have to get back on the field for that to continue, and that's up in the air right now. It's a little questionable, but he has been everything that we wanted him to be so far this season. He's on the field all the time, number one, because he can do it all. He can block and he can catch. He's been a red zone target for Ryan Tannehill. Some of that might be because A.J. Brown has been out for the first few weeks, but a lot of it is because this Titans team is used to featuring the tight end. Jonnu Smith is the new Delaney Walker, and he can do everything Delaney Walker could do. He's very good. I think he's establishing himself as a top 5 tight end moving forward. So that's the good news there. So you're definitely starting Jonnu Smith. You're definitely going to start A.J. Brown because there's nobody else to throw the ball to down the field. So he's going to get all the volume. And you have to play Derrick Henry. I think where it becomes a little bit questionable is Ryan Tannehill. Now, he is our QB 11, so he's on that teetering QB1, QB2 for us. He is somebody that we're suggesting that you can play. And I do believe that you can. But keep in mind that because this team hasn't actually practiced in 2 weeks, don't expect them to be super sharp, especially in the beginning of the game. I wouldn't expect them to be on their P's and Q's, being that they haven't been able to practice past couple of weeks.